Have you ever looked at an old map and wondered why the Southern Atlantic was once labeled the Ethiopian Sea? It's a name so rare today that you might have to dig into musty archives to find it. Yet for centuries, that was how map makers and scholars referred to this vast stretch of ocean. If that alone isn't intriguing enough, consider this. The modern nation of Ethiopia, which used to be called Abyssinia, is nowhere near the Atlantic at all. It's in the far east of Africa, closer to the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. To understand this, we will need to go to the very beginning of this ancient story. Our story begins more than 2,800 years ago with the famous poems of Homer. In his books, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer talks about a faraway land called Ethiopia. In his stories, the people of Ethiopia were called the blameless Ethiopians. The Greek word Ethiopia comes from two words, etho, which means to burn, and ops, which means face. This is often understood to mean burnt-faced. In Homer's view, the Ethiopians lived at the edge of the known world. They were so far away that even the gods visited them. A quote by Homer in the Odyssey, "But the gods went yesterday to feast with the Ethiopians, those distant folk. It was a land full of dark-skinned people who were admired and respected." For many years, writers, mapmakers, and storytellers kept using the name Ethiopia to talk about this special part of Africa. Later, in the 5th century BCE, we meet a famous historian named Herodotus. He is known as the father of history. In his work, called Histories, Herodotus described the world as he knew it. He talked about the lands south of Egypt and called them Ethiopia. He told stories of Egyptian traders and explorers who went to these lands. He also described the people of Ethiopia. For of all the nations in the world, the Ethiopians and the Indians were famed as being the tallest and fairest people. Herodotus' stories help people imagine Ethiopia as a very large area deep inside Africa. This idea later helped people name the nearby ocean as the Ethiopian Sea. Greek legends made Ethiopia even more exciting. There is the legend of Memnon, an Ethiopian king and the son of Eos, the Dawn, who fought in the Trojan War. His brave acts linked the Trojan War stories with the lands far south of Egypt. Another famous myth is about Andromeda and Perseus. In some versions of this story, the princess Andromeda lived near the shores of Ethiopia, and Perseus saved her from a scary sea monster. These stories show that ancient people thought of Ethiopia as a distant yet important land next to mysterious seas. In some versions of the myth, Andromeda's parents, King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia, are said to rule over Ethiopia. This makes the idea of an Ethiopian coast, a place of wonder and danger, in Greek stories. As ancient geographers learned more about the world, they started to use the name Ethiopia for both the land and the waters next to it. By the Hellenistic period, writers began to call the southern part of the Atlantic Ocean the Ethiopian Sea. In Greek, Okeanos Ethiopos. For example, a famous writer named Strabo, 1st century BCE to 1st century CE, wrote about the large lands south of Egypt and the Red Sea. He explained that these lands had many kinds of plants, animals, and people. This idea helped people believe that the big ocean next to these lands could be called the Ethiopian Sea. Another important scholar, Claudius Ptolemy, lived in the 2nd century CE. He wrote a book called Geographia that guided mapmakers for over 1,000 years. Ptolemy divided the seas around Africa into different parts. One of these parts was the Ethiopian Sea in the southwest. The idea of an Ethiopian Sea was not just a name on a map. Greek historians like Diodorus Siculus and the writer Palafidus told stories about the Gorgons, scary creatures with snakes for hair, living on islands in the Ethiopian Sea. Some experts think these islands might be the Cape Verde Islands today. When people moved from ancient times into the Middle Ages, European map makers made maps based on the Bible and old stories. Their maps were not very accurate, but they still used the name Ethiopia for the lands south of Egypt. Sometimes the name even appeared on the seas around those lands. On these maps, Ethiopia was often shown in a way that did not match the real world, but it still kept the idea of a great land in Africa. By the 15th and 16th centuries, during the Age of Discovery, Portuguese explorers sailed along Africa's coast. They went around the Cape of Good Hope and found new ways to reach India. As they made new maps, they used old names from Latin texts. They used names like Oceanus Aethiopicus or Mare Aethiopicum for the southern Atlantic Ocean. Famous map makers such as Gerardus Mercator, 1512 to 1594, and Jodocus Hondius, 1563 to 1612, printed many globes and atlases with the name Oceanus Aethiopicus. On some 16th century maps, the part of the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator was called Sinus Occidentalis, Western Gulf. The part south of the equator was labeled Oceanus Aethiopicus. During this time, Portugal claimed a large part of the Atlantic near Africa as its own, calling it Mare Clausum, closed sea. They wanted to control trade and navigation. On some maps, the new political ideas were mixed with the old classical name, Ethiopian Sea. This showed a time when old knowledge and new power worked together on maps. By the 17th century, new scientific ideas made people want clear and standard names for places. However, even in the 18th century, you could still see maps by the Homan Ayres, 1743, and Matthew Carey, 1795, that used the term Ethiopian Sea. These maps show that the old name continued to be used even though new ideas were taking over. By the early 19th century, countries started to make their maps more accurate. They chose one clear name for the whole ocean. With the help of works like the British Admiralty charts and the French Dépôt des cartes et plans de la marine, the name Ethiopian Sea slowly disappeared. Soon, textbooks and scientific works taught that the entire ocean west of Africa was called the Atlantic Ocean, no matter what part of it you looked at. One interesting fact is that an American scientist named William Albert Setchell, 1864 to 1943, once brought back the old name. He used the term Ethiopian Sea for some waters around islands near Antarctica when he studied sea plants. Even though his idea did not become popular, it shows that some scientists still liked the old classical name even in the 20th century. From an Afrocentric point of view, the story of the Ethiopian Sea shows us that ancient people saw sub-Saharan Africa as a very important and rich place. Historians like Cheikh Anta Diop have said that ancient Greek and Roman writers admired the great civilizations of Ethiopia and Nubia. Greek myths even told of gods having feasts with Ethiopians or praising them as strong and noble. These stories make it clear that Ethiopia was not an unknown wilderness. It was a place full of respect and great culture. Sometimes the word Ethiopia was also used to mean the kingdom of Kush or Nubia. This kingdom was centered around the cities of Meroe or Napata in what is now Sudan. Kush had close ties with ancient Egypt. They traded with each other and even shared rulers sometimes. Because of these strong connections, Greek mapmakers named the nearby waters Ethiopian, after the famous land. The name Ethiopia has changed over time. A long time ago, it meant a very large area of Africa. Today, the name is used only for the country in the Horn of Africa, which was also called Abyssinia. It is interesting that the modern country of Ethiopia is not near the Atlantic Ocean at all. Yet for many centuries, the southern Atlantic was known by a name that came from Ethiopia. A well-known example of Ethiopia in Greek stories is the tale of Perseus saving Andromeda from a sea monster. In many versions of the myth, Andromeda's parents were rulers of Ethiopia. This shows that the story was set near the coast of this ancient land. Even if the writers mixed up the coasts of the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, or the Southwest Atlantic, they still place the story in the world of Ethiopia. Stories by writers like Diodorus Siculus and Palaephatus tell us that the Southwest Atlantic was full of mythical beasts. They wrote that the Gorgons, creatures with snakes for hair, lived on islands in the Ethiopian Sea. These tales show that the ancient Greeks thought of the Southwest Atlantic as a wild and mysterious place connected to Africa. It was seen as a land of strange wonders and dangers. The heroic figure Memnon appears in later Greek stories. He led an army from Ethiopia to help the Trojans fight against the Greeks. This tale mixes history with legend and shows how important an African heritage was to these stories. In a famous atlas by Ortelius called Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the word Ethiopia is spread over the inside parts of Africa. Even though not all maps from that time called the Southern Atlantic the Ethiopian Sea, the idea was still strong. It helped people see that the name of the land could also be used for the sea nearby. Many globes made by Mercator and later maps by Hondius clearly show the difference between the Northern Atlantic, called Atlanticus, and the Southern Atlantic, called Oceanus Ethiopicus. These works were very important and helped shape how Europeans saw the world for many years. By the 18th century, many map makers started to change and combine names. But famous publishers like the Holman Ayres still used Ethiopia for the land in Africa, and Ethiopian Sea for the water next to it. Matthew Carey's Atlas from 1795 is another proof that the old name was still in use, even when new ideas were coming into play. By the early 1800s, new tools and ideas made map-making much more modern. Countries started to use one clear name for the whole ocean. As a result, the old name Ethiopian Sea slowly disappeared from maps and books. Even though the name Ethiopian Sea does not appear on maps today, its memory lives on. It reminds us that long ago, Africa was seen as a central part of the world. The people of Africa, honored in ancient stories and maps, gave their name to a vast stretch of ocean. This shows that Africa was important in global history, even if myths mixed with facts. Over time, names change. The Ethiopian Sea went from being a common name to one that is now old. As European empires grew, the old names from Africa were replaced with new, standard names. The term Ethiopian Sea helps bring back Africa's important place in history. Even though later stories sometimes left Africa out, ancient writers recognized the rich cultures next to these southern waters. Greek and Roman stories about Ethiopia and its seas were not just made-up tales. They came from real travel, trade, and meeting new cultures. Over many years, these stories helped shape how people in the West thought about Africa. Modern-day reflection. Even though we do not use the name Ethiopian Sea today, remembering it helps us think about how names change over time. It shows us that the water next to Africa was once called something that honored Africa's long and important history.